study of what seems to have emerged as a theme on animal gliders. So I'm going to talk about a few things. This is a flying snake. This is a video that was produced by one of my colleagues, Jake Soha, along with National Geographic. And this is showing a snake that's about as wide as a garden hose and maybe this long. And it flattens its body and basically turns itself into a living morphing wheel. And it undulates. And that's sort of the main thing that I'll talk about when I refer to a snake. Most animals, when they undulate, they do that for locomotion. We think this does it just to maintain rotational stability, but we'll get to that. This is another glider. This is a flying squirrel. This is a BBC bird. You can see it. I think they only do this at night, and so this was a camera crew following a group of researchers studying these squirrels. They jump in trees. They spread out flaps of skin, and as you can see, they're actually going around trees. They do some interesting maneuvering around obstacles. This is the Draco lizard, again by BBC Earth, and this is the lizard that opens up its arms. It's got a flattened skin, and it can also fly from tree to tree in tropical areas. This is called the Draco lizard, and saying a little bit about what it does. And there's a whole variety of gliders. Maybe I'll focus on just those three: the squirrel, the Draco, and the flying snake. But there's flying fish jump out of the water. There was an interesting viral video recently of one that was really cruising pretty fast and playing aloft for like 10 seconds at a time. One of the best is that beluga, which just looks like a creepy flying bat. But these are just gliding. They don't flap and achieve upward flight, at least for very long. But we have a large diversity of these gliders. So I'm going to talk three different topics. The first one will be about a common framework to understand gliding in terms of a really simple model of an airfoil. And one of the motivations is that doing a physical space comparison is difficult. So I'm showing vertical distance and horizontal distance. And typically, the way that gliding is understood is in terms of the equilibrium glide. The equilibrium is where the glide angle, so that's the descent angle with respect to the horizontal, that has to meet certain criteria related to the lift and drag. So lift and drag as a function of that glide angle needs to equal the cotangent of that angle. And that's only when things are just sort of steadily moving, steadily going downward. And now I've overlaid different animal species. Green is the lizard, blue is the squirrel, and gray is the snake, all on the same physical scale. We don't see many portions where things are moving actually very, very straight. But it is difficult when we look at physical space this way. So we want to do some rescaling. First, we're going to look at a model. So we've got these different animal gliders, and the common model will just be an airfoil where we're looking at there's a total angle of attack alpha, but then we've got forces of lift and drag that depend on not only alpha, but we can break alpha into the glide angle, which is the angle going down gamma, plus a pitch angle. And most of what I'll be doing is taking the pitch angle as a control input. So either it's fixed or we can adjust it, but we're not going to be looking at the dynamics of the pitch. So the equations of motion, they're pretty easy to write down from F equals ma. We're just including the effects of gravity, lift, and drag. So this rho is the density of air, and then we have lift and drag as a function of just angle of attack for alpha. We can non-dimensionalize using a chord length. Chord length is the length of the airfoil. And then we can put things in a different form where we get this parameter epsilon that we call the universal gliding parameter. And it's just rho g over 2. That's basically constant for all gliders through air. And then things that are dependent on the animal, which are the chord length and wing loading. Wing loading is just the weight divided by the surface area of the airfoil. We can do a further rescaling with this universal gliding parameter. First, let me just plot what we get. If we look at the various species, we're showing on the vertical axis here that gliding parameter, and then over here just the mass. Flying squirrels and colugos, and also the Draco, all have very similar gliding parameters. Flying fish and the flying snake are kind of down here, and I even put in dragonflies. If you wanted to see how this compares with some man-made things, a sailplane and a Boeing 747 are over here, but they're still within roughly the same order of magnitude. So it's interesting that over almost 10 orders of magnitude of mass, this gliding parameter varies by only 1 or 2 orders. So when we rescale, we can rescale using that universal gliding parameter. And we get some equations that have no parameters at all, except for the angle of attack. So that's where we've got lift and drag. And these are the only animal-specific parts of the model anymore. So the size, mass has been scaled out. So we're hoping that within these coordinates, we can make a better comparison than the typical slider. So the angle of attack, as I've said before, that's the angle between the chord and the velocity. So that is actually the pitch plus the glide angle. And we're going to treat pitch as a model input. So just to look at the simplest thing that's not an angle, a falling plate. So a falling plate, there was some work done by Jane Wong's group where they looked at experimentally the lift and drag for a falling plate as a function angle of attack, and we're able to fit some very simple looking functions to it. So the curves here are these functions up here for drag and lift. And we're going to use this as sort of a simple standard to look at. So I'm going to claim that the trajectories in phase in velocity space are more revealing than just looking at the position. So if we were to drop the plate with some initial horizontal speed, you would get this for position space. In velocity space, though, you pick up some subtleties that maybe aren't exactly obvious here. That when the animal jumps or when we drop a plate, the velocity, the horizontal velocity quickly drops. So this is VZ, horizontal velocity, it's going negative. And this is all in non-dimensional units. And then it seems to slowly fall toward maybe an equilibrium. So we've got that initial velocity and then this convergence there in equilibrium. If we now put some context to what that particular trajectory looked like, the trajectory started out with a slightly, starting out slightly to the right and then fell, and then it headed to this equilibrium point. But what we're showing are all of the other trajectories that would be possible. So this all possible trajectories approach is really common in nonlinear dynamics and chaos. We would call it the phase plane, phase portrait. And what's notable here is that all trajectories converge. They might be converging to this equilibrium point, but they first converge to this feature, some one-dimensional feature that we call the terminal velocity manifold, because it's like a higher dimensional analog of the terminal velocity point. And this is sometimes called this velocity space view. Isn't new. People who look at gliding often call this the velocity polar diagram. I'm not using polar coordinates, so I don't necessarily like that name. That's the name that we've got. And if we look at just a bunch of initial, say, jump conditions, we're just taking a bunch of initial conditions and then following where they go. In this case, everything goes to an equilibrium point. In purple, what we've also shaded about a region that is close to equilibrium, say less than 0.05 g acceleration. So this just shows for any initial condition, there's the trajectory progress, we've got equilibrium. The airspeed you can get, at least in the rescale form, just by looking at the arrow connecting the origin to the current point. The glide angle, same way. And then we have this feature that we're calling the terminal velocity manifold. We can now compare different airfoils. So these are, this is the flat plate, lift and drag for the flat plate, and what the velocity space looks like. Here's another airfoil. This actually comes from the snake. So when the snake goes into its airborne configuration, it has this symmetric airfoil shape. And it's got some interesting lift and drag curves that have been determined experimentally. And you can see it's somewhat similar, but we've got some other features. We've got multiple equilibrium points. There still seems to be a terminal velocity manifold. And then a NACA airfoil, for comparison, it somewhat resembles the flat plate in that there's just one equilibrium point, and the lift and drag curves are slightly more interesting than these sinusoidal curves.
Can I ask a good question?
Yeah.
I don't understand. So you get all this terminal velocity if you, of course, somehow stabilize this thing. Otherwise, it's just going to flop around. And right, there's no need
so we're not considering any rotational dynamics.
Oh,
So
okay.
we're abstracting that away.
Yeah.
So actually, what is interesting here because I saw like your coefficient and lift and drag curve is very similar to the flat plate results. But actually, from what we ran from the CFD, I think it's a bit of I'm kind of like curious about where you get those lift and drag coefficient from, or from those kind of alpha, and so is it from experiments or something?
So for the flat plate, that was an experiment. I think at Reynolds number 100.
Oh, okay.
So if you look at other Reynolds number, you may have something else.
Yeah. Okay.
And this was for a Reynolds number about 10,000, something appropriate for the snake.
Okay.
For the NACA airfoil, something appropriate for grid. I'll mostly be talking about animals, and so they'll be usually between 1,000 and 10,000.
Okay. But like between 0 to 45 angle of attack, I think it's and monotonically increases. So it's like what's shown in the curve. Yeah.
Maybe here?
Yeah.
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 So we can also look at dependence on pitch. We're using pitch as some input parameter. So this is what the velocity space looks like if we have zero pitch. So this is showing the effect of changing the pitch just slightly. This is a -5 degrees. Then no matter where you start, this thing, because we're not specifying how the pitch is being maintained, but if you could, then this will go to a glide that's going to the right, and it'll be definitely more than 5 degrees. We're looking, it's not going straight down, it's getting closer to 45 degrees. This is the flat plate at -15 degrees. You can see this way. In terms of topology of this terminal velocity manifold, it's not really changed. There's one equilibrium point and everything goes. But we can look at a variety of things. So we can, this is the flying snake cross section. So I showed these lift and drag curves before. And then in green, this is the lift over drag curve. And we could also get look at lift and drag curves that have been collected for other animal fibers. So this is the snake velocity diagram when it's inclined at -5 degrees pitch. Here's what happens when it goes to 0. It hasn't really changed its character. There's still just one equilibrium point. But when we go to 5 degrees pitch, okay, something's changed. We've had what we say in nonlinear dynamics is the bifurcation. So a bifurcation has occurred. You notice here we have these terminal velocity manifolds. And then something else seemed to happen once we got over here. There's actually a dividing line between what we would call a good glide and a bad glide. And I'll say more about that later. But I want to just emphasize now is as you go through different, look at different pitch angles, you can find different equilibrium glide angles. So this is the glide angle, gamma star, as a function of pitch. So we get these interesting bifurcation diagrams, depending on the lift and drag curves. And how does this happen? Well, remember that condition for equilibrium. It was that lift over drag as a function of the angle of attack, which is now gamma plus the pitch equals cotangent gamma. So here's the cotangent gamma curve. Here is the lift over drag curve for, in this case, the snake. For this value of the pitch, we just have one intersection, so there's one equilibrium point. But if we were to increase pitch, then this curve will move over and we'll get multiple intersections. And every time there's a tangency, there's going to be a bifurcation. Most likely saddle node bifurcation. So this is giving multiple equilibrium. And we can classify the equilibrium points by just looking at the lift and drag curves and their derivatives as a function of angle of attack. When people just assume a constant lift and drag, which has been done before for people studying animal gliders, they're only looking at this little section, which means they can only see saddle nodes and then stable spirals. So that's been what's accessible before and seen before. But when we now consider that we have angle of attack dependent lift and drag curves, we can get other features happening. Unstable spirals, saddle points. It's even possible we can get other types of exotic bifurcations, like Hopf bifurcations, that give rise to rivet cycles. So if we now stitch together all of the terminal velocities for each value of theta, we get this surface. So this is showing different views of the surface, and along that surface, so we call that an attracting manifold. And then we've got this equilibrium submanifold embedded in it. So everything will quickly go to this attracting manifold, and then it moves towards the equilibrium. This is for the NACA airfoil. You see there's more interesting stuff going on there. And you can get some 3D views. What's going on here? I should forget what red and blue means. So what can we do with this simple model? Well, we could input a pitch, say change pitch as a function of time, and just see what happens in terms of the dynamics as an output. So if we look at the pitch as an output for just a falling plate, so we're sinusoidally going between plus or minus 18 degrees for pitch. This is what we get in terms of the velocity dynamics as an output. So it seems to go onto a limit cycle, but the limit cycle is driven by our pitch as an input. We look at what the plate would do. We're just showing the orientation of the plate along with its center line as it falls. And this is what the picture looks like in terms of the terminal velocity manifold in that sort of extended three-dimensional space of Vx, Vy, and pitch. We could also look at horizontal gliding, where we, in this case, will just linearly increase pitch. And I'll use that snake airfoil as an input just because it's so weird. But if we start at negative pitch, so pitch negative 30 and go up to positive 15 degrees, this is the resulting velocity dynamics. If we just start at rest, so this is just subsets an airfoil that's just released, but we're changing the pitch, and you'll notice this thing goes down, and then it's probably going onto a terminal velocity manifold. But then as the pitch increases, it's kind of trying to follow that equilibrium point. So this is what it looks like in terms of the position and orientation, and then in terms of the extended terminal velocity manifold space. This is another view showing the snake in green, or just the airfoil, and how things are evolving on the velocity space here. This will start over, but you can see that the blue line is the same thing, essentially the same thing we showed before. The black is giving the current velocity, and this is quickly going to a terminal velocity manifold and then going to the equilibrium point along there. Now, when we have the case of a saddle showing up, then we can get something interesting. And this shows up for the flying squirrel. We've got a region where there's an equilibrium point that would be a shallow glide, and then another equilibrium point that's a pretty steep glide. And then we've got a boundary between what are two basins. So this would be the basin of stability, meaning if you start anywhere in here, you will end up at that good shallow glide. If you start anywhere in here, you go to the bad glide. So two nearby initial jump velocities can lead to dramatically different glides. So this is a mechanism that animals use. We're sort of thinking of this simple model as a way to generate hypotheses and later be tested. We also saw, and it's again flying squirrel, seemed to show a Hopf bifurcation, which we didn't necessarily expect. So the terminal velocity manifold isn't always present, and it's sometimes replaced by a limit cycle. So for the flying squirrel, we found that there was a case of an unstable periodic orbit showing up, and it shapes the motion of nearby trajectories. If you're wondering why do we only have this sector, it's because we only used the part that we had experimentally. So we only had a little sector of angles of attack. So if we look at the bifurcation diagram here, we have an unstable focus turning into an unstable limit cycle. We're just showing the limit side here. And then it just sort of runs into the sides and we can't follow it perfect. So that was unexpected. But just to summarize this first part of looking at the simple model of gliding, we've got multiple modes of non-equilibrium gliding. And it seems like the equilibrium points organize these velocity diagrams. We could also get bifurcations. And this work was mostly due to two former PhD students, Isaac Gaten and Gary. Isaac's at APL now. Gary is working in Colorado. Now, sometimes when I mention flying snakes and manifold planes, I think of Samuel L. Jackson. I don't know if anyone has seen snakes on a plane. I personally haven't. I have not. I just know there's some famous quote. I've added with the antenna snakes on the plane. I think it means manifold. So I'm going to talk about the snakes. This work is with Jake Soha. He's a professor at Virginia Tech. It started around the same time as I did, and he showed up obsessed with these flying snakes. I said, "Oh, we could do this right."
Sure it was.
The way that they turn their body into an airfoil, I used to think they used to kind of move their rib cage up. I think they're actually rotating their rib cage out. So if you don't know about snakes have, in this case, it's about 200 vertebrae. And so they'll take their ribs and pull them out. And so that sounds unpleasant, but hey, I'm not a snake. And then flattens their body to roughly this shape. We actually haven't measured it in flight. So this is just Jake's best guess, but it's a pretty good guess. And they often are in this sinuous pattern where they've got multiple airfoils, and then there's these bends. I'm not going to be talking about the interaction between different airfoils, but that is something that comes up. So we're going to just look at something simpler. The lift and drag curves have been obtained experimentally by just taking that shape, in some sense 3D printing it, putting it in a wind tunnel, and measuring the lift and drag. And so this is showing lift and drag for different Reynolds numbers between 5 and 13,000. And you see for some values of the Reynolds number, you get this peak. And really there, they're experimental. And this is lift over drag. So let me show you some experiments that were done. This is high-speed video of a snake in an indoor gliding arena at Virginia Tech. It's actually like a dance studio. We retrofitted it. There's foam on the ground. This is a pretty good glide for the snake. It's hard to get animals to cooperate, so I don't really participate much with the animal experiments because, it's hard. We let students
Were any manifold snakes injured during the experiments?
Yes.
But if you look at it, right, it's moving around. It's definitely a morphing wing body. If we just sort of take one particular snapshot, we've got the airflow going over a few sections that are perpendicular to the airflow, and then we've got these, we call them U bends, and they're traveling down the body. Everything's moving down the body because this thing is undulating. It's a snake, right? And so we wondered, well, is there a mechanical role of undulation? Is it just undulating because that's what snakes do, or does it actually have some kind of? So I'm going to show you for this section 2 parts: the high resolution kinematics, what is aerial undulation, and then some mathematical modeling. We'll use what we discovered from the kinematics as input. So this is that gliding arena. It's called the Cube, and it's actually connected to our art center. And when they built this, they had no idea that there'd be a bunch of creepy snakes flying around it. This was meant to record performances. motion capture for performances. Do some interesting digital stuff. So it's equipped with motion capture cameras all over. It's roughly a cube. We're releasing the snakes from about 8 meters up from a cherry picker that you can crank up there. And this is showing, it's kind of hard to see, this is a snake sort of in this J configuration, which is what it does right before it jumps, and this is right after it leaves. So we've got 23 cameras at around 180 frames per second, mostly focused on the range where we expect the snakes to fly. And then we've got infrared markers on snakes. We use 7 snakes, the range and mass from 37 to 107 grams, lightweight. This SBL stands for snout to vent length. And this is about 1 meter. And then in it, so I didn't know this before I studied. Snakes have tails. I thought, isn't it a tail? Apparently not. So yeah, 11 to 17 infrared markers. If we were to just look at the sort of position, sideways position that we saw before, this is for one particular snake, kind of the best glider. The lighter ones, which are the younger ones, tend to be better glider.
But the glide ratio is pretty small.
Yeah, this is actually quite a bit steeper than we've seen in the wild. And we don't know if it's because they know they're inside or these are snakes that are kept in captivity, so they don't get out much. But we've seen much shallower glides in the wild, but we were able to get high quality data, right? With this. Now, again, if we look at the velocity, we can kind of see patterns that aren't obvious here. We kind of see the same thing that we expected from just the simple glider model. So things are falling and then they're slowly rising up. Is it because they're going on to some kind of terminal velocity manifold? But we were interested in the undulation. So that means not just where's the center of mass moving, but how is this snake as a whole moving? So to track, if we track all of those infrared points, this is a side view, and then we've got a top view over here. You can see we get a bunch of spaghetti. But we want to reconstruct the snake. So from the measured infrared marker locations, we get a natural cubic spline. Natural means that you can't change the length, right? Normal splines that you use when you're not even thinking about it on MATLAB, it doesn't really care about the length. We're trying to constrain the length to be the length of the snake. And then we can, from that curve, at each moment in time, get a tangent vector. So we've got tangent vectors all along the length of the curve, which is parameterized by this arc length parameter S. So S starts here at 0 and then goes all the way to. And with that, then we can construct an airfoil coordinate system. So we've got the tangent vector and then the 2 vectors that are orthogonal to that. We've got chord and then what completes the right-handed system. So we've got everything we need to sort of make an anatomically correct model of the snake. We want to look at how the width of the airfoil changed along the body of the snake. So based on mid-glide silhouette images from several snakes, we're looking at the width as a percentage of the SBL, that snout to vent length, along the snout to vent length. So the snake is widest in the middle, and then it's kind of shortest at the 2 ends, and then the tail is significantly different. And I don't think the tail airfoil has this shape. It's somewhat different. We also, from sacrifice snakes, were able to get the density. So this is the linear density. And you see it also seems to form a similar pattern. This is the head up here, but then the middle of the body is also has the highest density. So from that, we can overlay the width and the mass, and we can get highly reconstructed snakes. So this is just from the procedures that I mentioned before. This is a video of the snake. And even though I think we had about 100 successful snake trials, only 36 of them we were able to get to this high level. Because again, they're animals, they don't cooperate. Now we can use that tangent that's along the snake, we've got X, Y, and Z components, and we can look at the horizontal and vertical waves to quantify the aerial undulation. So this is showing we can get this angle theta and psi as a function of length along the body, so our length has. And what we find experimentally is this. So on the right, I'll just be showing overhead what the snake looks like. And on the left, this is the horizontal and vertical waves taken from a snake in flight. So you can see the blue are the horizontal waves, and the green are the vertical waves. And we're showing them in terms of degrees. And some things stand out here. The vertical wave has twice the spatial and temporal frequency. The zero crossings of that horizontal or lateral wave happen at the U-bends. The two waves are phase shifted by 90 degrees, and there's a maximum out of plane bending at those U-bends. We could also use complex orthogonal decomposition to get at the spatial frequencies and the temporal frequencies. And so what I'm showing here is the spatial frequency ratio and the temporal frequency ratio, and they cluster at around 2. So this frequency ratio of 2 was somewhat unexpected. It's been seen before in other snakes that they have a difference between their horizontal and vertical waves, the sidewinders. So they have different waves, but their ratio is 1. So these are the only snakes where the ratio of the two frequencies is 2. And we use that for the next part, which is the mathematical model. So now we know we were able to tease out from these high resolution kinematics that there, in addition to that horizontal wave, which is pretty obvious, there's a vertical wave that was previously unknown. So now we're going to prescribe horizontal or lateral wave and then vertical wave using some nice looking formulas. And with the ratios given by what we saw experimentally. And from these angles, as a function of arc length and time, we can reconstruct what the body is doing. So this is sort of the idealized snake wave. And we want to use this as an input to simulation. Let's see what happens. So we developed a new dynamical model of snake flight. We've got a frame that moves with the snake. The details of that are not simple. You're like, well, what's the off pitch and roll for undulating noodle? Yeah, it's not even. We'd have to talk about that later. But we've got the lift and the weight. So lift is integrated along the body, and that gives the motion of the center of mass. And then the aerodynamic moments, rigid body terms, and inertial moments for the rotational dynamics. We've got some other terms in here. These inertial moments, you're noticing there's an I dot here, right? If this was an actual rigid body and we're looking in the rigid body frame, there wouldn't be any change in time to the moment of inertia tensor. But because the mass is shifting around, we do get that. So there's some effective changing moments. I mentioned this before that you use experimental lift and drag curves, but the aerodynamic forces we used just blade element theory and simple sweep theory. So we're looking at just the velocity that's perpendicular to a segment. So because this is simulation, we can look at if we look at a simulated glide with undulation, and this is only looking at. I think this is just a horizontal wave. We don't even have a vertical component here. And I'm showing the drag is gray and lift is in blue. And this is a side view. So that's where the center of mass is, which is the top view. So this thing is veering a little bit to the right, but it's mostly staying upright. And when it lands, it'll be upright. And this was an actual snake. It can slither away. Now, experimentally, it isn't ethical to freeze a snake and then toss it. I guess we could make some 3D model and throw it, but you can kind of guess what would happen. If you take a frisbee and throw it, just like toss it like that, you don't spin it, you just toss it. What does it do? It tumbles. Well, same thing's going to happen with the snake. So this is turning the undulation off. We have aerodynamic forces building as the speed builds up, and then this thing just goes sideways. And once it gets to 90 degrees, we just turn it off. Say this is unstable. So what we think is going on is that undulation doesn't have anything to do with propulsion here, but it provides rotational stability, which leads to successful glides. So we've got the undulation off. At least one of the angles, the tilt essentially will go to 90 degrees. With undulation on, it'll oscillate.
Is it fair to compare, Andy, what you said with the frisbee? I mean, you take your shake and put them in a round
the
shape.
frisbee is spinning around an act, whereas this isn't necessarily spinning. It's redistributing its forces.
Yeah, I can imagine that the undulation. I mean, there's a very interesting thing in if you do balancing of an inverted pendulum, right? You can move it to the left and right, but there's another way to balance this is to jerk it up and down the whole time.
Yeah.
So it looks like
Kapitsa,
sure,
the Kapitsa pendulum.
whatever. Yeah.
So I think we've actually thought about that. I think the oscillations here are too slow, right? The Kapitsa pendulum, the vibration has to be very high compared to some other time
Could be.
scale.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
And we're not sure about that. There's been some work on stability of flapping flight by Hopf and Taha at UC Irvine, where they think
Similar concept.
vibration-induced stability.
Yeah.
Here we might say it's undulation-induced stability, and it probably has more subtleties.
Gotcha.
But yeah, that's all yet to be done.
Right.
This is just a summary. We got the 3D kinematics, and then took an idealized model of the snake and simulated that. But the punchline is that undulation seems to enhance stability, enable gliding, and that's why they undulate. So there's a lot of other fascinating things about these animals. Just like the squirrel, they can, even though they're a snake, they can maneuver around things. They can do rather sharp turns, especially at low speeds. And at high speeds, they do. I don't know if they're kind of biasing their waves, but they can go around.
You can pitch to a really high angle tag and then stop on a tree. Yeah.
These just sort of run into the tree.
Okay.
Yeah, the lizards and squirrels need to land on the tree.
But it's so flat.
Yeah, my colleague Jake Soha, he's studied the landing dynamic because they just sort of run into branches, and so they're hitting at very high G force, but they're fine. They just sort of flying around. They're very versatile. If anyone wants to study it more. Just following on this is actually work that's more in progress. We've looked at the Draco lizard. This is work in collaboration with Pranav Kandawal and Kai Hedrick. They have a paper in Scientific Reports from this year where, from experiments where they went into the wild, set up a bunch of cameras. I think they were GoPros, and looked at what Draco lizards were doing from a particular tree, and they got a bunch of good glides. And this is a Draco glide reconstructed from those multiple cameras. They divided things here into sort of an early phase, a mid-glide phase, and then a landing phase. So this is just looking at a few key points on the body of the lizard and then the resulting forces. So you see that, yeah, this is definitely pitching up, right? And then lands on the tree. If you look at the velocity diagram for multiple trials here, what they saw is that things seem to go down, and then they don't just sort of settle and go to an equilibrium point, they seem to be turning back. And so that seems suggestive to me of pitch control. And how is it controlling this pitch? Well, there was something that we ignored before, was that it has a tail. And I think it's the tail that's helping with this pitch control. So this is a video now where we've included points on the tail, sort of the mid part of the tail and the end of the tail. And so at the beginning, the tail sort of whips around quite a bit. Maybe it's just trying to help with steering. And then it's doing adjustments during this mid-glide phase, and it definitely helps out towards the very end to help pitch this thing up. And we're just starting to look at this problem. So we're modeling the effect of the tail. The tail sort of has a conical shape. So as a first pass, we're looking at that as a a cone. This is not to scale, and then the body here. This is work by Mohammed Zafarian, undergrad at Ferrari. So even though the tail is a very small percent of the body mass, I say less than 5%, it's usually closer to 3%, but it seems to have an important role in stabilization, steering. So we're just beginning to look at that. Right, it affects the body through that reaction force at the point of connection. So stay tuned. That's work in progress. All right, the final section. It's not exactly a glider, but I thought I'd throw it in. It's not a similar thing. Are auto-rotating seats. So if you haven't seen maple trees, we've got a lot of maple trees in Virginia. I don't know what you have here. I forget. Cypress. That's right. Here's a bunch of maple seeds that we drop. And we're going to be looking at wind dispersal of both natural and then biomimetic ones. We basically scanned and copied and threw it out of windows. This is some interesting work that it started out as an undergrad exploratory project. We have a program where we pair up biology students and engineering students, and they come up with their own problem and then work on it. And it grew into a pretty good study. So if you don't know what samaras are, they're sometimes called helicopter seeds. This is what one looks like after it's kind of dried up. It consists of a seed, so this is where most of the weight is, and then this fibrous wing. And it has some biological advantages. If you've got seeds of a tree and they're non-samara, they'll just fall to the ground. But if you could take best advantage of the wind, say get a lot of hang time, then you could disperse much further. So that's what they seem to do. So this helps with species dispersal. And the different stages, there's the stage at which the seed comes off. Often when things are drying out here and the wind picks up enough, this is called abscission and the seed falls off. And then it goes through a stage where it's not yet auto-rotating, we call it transition. It's just sort of flopping around. But then it, at least within a couple of feet, it gets into the auto-rotation. Actually less than a couple of feet. I could have brought one. They're tiny, too tiny. So it goes into an auto-rotation state where it's steady, slow descent. And it's also moving sideways. That's important. So what we did is we took Norway maple and then another variety, the silver maple, and basically scanned and copied. And then saw how each of them did. So this is a competition between natural versus artificial. We wanted to make sure we got the mass distribution correct. So we took some seeds, sectioned them, weighed them. If you do that for a large number, then you could look at the average mass density curve. So this is a linear mass density. So this is from the seed tip over here. You can see most of the mass is there. The center of mass is at about 28% away. So about a little over a quarter from the seed end. So somewhere around there. We made the 3D printed samaras so that they had a similar center of mass. However, since we were stuck with the material that used for 3D prints, the wing loadings for our printed ones were about 50% higher. And there's a paper by Lenting, 2009 in Science, where they looked at samaras, and they showed that if it has a higher wing loading, then it should fall faster. We could also, although we didn't do this, we did a high resolution scan of one particular samara and thought we could 3D print this. Maybe these veins are important, but the 3D printers we have can't actually get it down to that scale. So kind of abandoned that. We did some indoor drop tests. So we looked at a natural and artificial seed. So the artificial is on the right, you kind of see it here, and then the natural on the left. They're being played at the same speed, and you can see the artificial one is falling quite a bit faster. It's actually falling about 3 times faster. And it seems to be very flat too, whereas this one is forming more of an angle. And we didn't do CFD modeling. There are other groups that have done that. We just wanted to experiment, see what happens. And also quantify. So for that natural and artificial, we could look at how the tip velocity is moving. That's a function of the rotation versus the descent speed. So they're overall similar. You can see there's more variability for the natural one. So I'm showing the standard deviation bars, whereas you would expect for something that's 3D printed, we're sort of mass producing, say 30 of them. They should all be quite the same like that, and they are. We also used a formula from Plenty where he showed how descent speed is a function of wing loading and something called the descent factor, which is based on the shape. Since these two have a very similar shape, we would expect that they'd have a similar descent factor, and they do. So they've got a similar descent factor. The wing loading is quite a bit more over here. The scale doesn't go to 0 level, but the wing loading is quite a bit more, but they still have somewhat similar descent. And we did some outdoor drop tests because we wanted to get at what is the dispersal pattern. So again, we borrowed kind of cherry picker and dropped from 3 meters height in different conditions. So we had a low wind day, and this is what we got for the low wind day. Actually, once things landed on the ground, we put a metal marker so that it wouldn't blow away. We've got these metal markers, and we get some careful measurements. On the windiest day, we got quite a bit of distance. So from about 3 meters, this one went about 25 meters away. So this was the furthest one, and the natural Samaras went further. So this is showing your landing position distribution. This is a low wind day, and I'm just showing this arc here is for 5 meters. So things didn't go up very far. The wind, we're taking the downwind position as the vertical direction here, and the crosswind, horizontal. For a high wind day, you can see the sort of furthest circle here is about 20 meters or so, or 25 actually. And we got things moving quite a bit further. I'm not sure why there were so many bias to the right. This is sort of the average wind directions, and there could have been things that were a little bit off, but they went further. It was also of interest to measure the windage. So this is a simple way to quantify how much does the Samara move laterally with the wind. So if it moved perfectly with the wind, it would be like a passive tracer. So we could say, well, based on what the wind speed was, how far would the passive tracer go, and how far did the actual Samara travel? And so they tended to have it. If you have something at 1, that means it moves exactly as a passive tracer. But we got things there where, on average, it's less than 1. You might wonder, how did things become higher than 1? Well, you've got turbulence. You might have some other unmodeled effects. But on average, right, we get things less than 1. And the natural ones seem to do better. So this is the only natural one that we considered, and it makes it too artificial. Is there an application for this? Possibly. If you could put some sensors in this, and there's been some work by others where they, instead of just making some kind of 3D printed shell, they'll make a microchip. It's got the shape of the wing, and you can release these. So if you could release a bunch of cheap, inexpensive, biodegradable sensors, you can use things like weather measurement or hazard assessment, if you want. But again, this was an undergraduate-driven project, and so they said, well, we just had the idea to make a really big one. So they made a really big, and then they wanted to actuate it and do some crazy things. And we thought, well, okay, maybe you could treat this like it's an airdrop delivery system that doesn't have a parachute. So we tried that out. It needs a parachute. You could use this for delivery of emergency supplies in places where road infrastructure is broken down, maybe flood or mountain survival. So we were thinking, well, you could drop things from a drone, and you could have medicine and other supplies. Another professor in my department, Craig Woolsey, found that, I don't know how he found this, But this is an article from Scientific American in the midst of World War II. And they have something they call the skyhook that I think they say it resembles a maple pot. It looks like a weird guitar case to me. It's also very heavy. So 65 pounds of supplies coming in at 35 feet per second, 10 meters per second. You don't want to be under this. That's the only mention we found, though. This is before there was an Air Force. It was the Army Air Forces.
So that can do auto rotation at a descending speed of 10 meters per second.
Yeah, that's what they say. Yeah. So we built some. This one is about a meter long. This was a prototype made out of balsa wood. Got some mass here. And we just dropped this from the top of a building. And hey, we get some kind of interesting spiraling behavior. Well, let's make this drop further. So we don't have too many tall bridges in Virginia, but we have some. And this is the second tallest bridge, 55 meters, really close to campus back there. I think this is technically part of the Virginia Tech campus. So I'm showing two views. This is the view from the bottom on the right, and then a view from the top. I was at the bottom because this thing had a railing like down here, and I'm scared of heights. So I said, you do it. What do I call it? I'll stay there. Come on. So he dropped this, and you could see it within about 10 feet. It went into the auto rotation mode, and it's kind of doing spirals upon spirals here. We could also instrument it. I'm showing this one that was actuated. It broke on the first try, so I'm not saying much more about it. But the others did have instrumentation so that we could record the height, and as a function of time, we could get, when did we release from the bridge, when did it hit the ground, and estimate the descent speed. So this one had a descent speed of about 4 meters per second. So again, using this is a plot from Lenting, and our initial design was over here, so it had a pretty high wing loading, and this is actually 1 over the descent speed, but it seemed to fit really good. We then took another design and dropped this from a drone. So an instrumentation package dropped from a drone, and this was pretty cool. We don't actually have a hook. It's a lot easier. You just sort of put it on. You put a hole in the Samara next to a drone. The drone goes up with that side facing the wind. So the wind is helping keep it on, and then you just rotate and the wind pulls it on. We did that. And this is the view from the drone and the view from the ground. So that we turn, you're looking at the drone one. So we were able to drop from 120 meters and so at least demonstrate proof of concept that this could work. We tried different payload masses and looked at the descent speed. So we want a low descent speed, right? Because if we're trying to deliver something fragile, it can break with the lowest possible. We seem to get something around 4 meters per second as the lowest over quite a range. So I imagine if one were to operationally use these, you want to design them so that they have some range of payload mass. So this would be rated for, like, let's say 100 to 300 grams. You can make another one that's rated to other payload masses. If you have a payload mass of 0, falls like a rock, which is kind of not intuitive. And if you have too much payload mass, again, it falls like a rock. So, well, what if you want to drop from a great height? You could have a mode where it's just falling quickly, and then once you get to the ground, you go into glide mode. So you have sort of a Samara shape that folds. So this is the fall mode, and then it goes into the glide mode. So we did some tests. We tried fall mode. There it is. And it falls. And then glue it back together. Just see if it works. And there we go. Wow. Now we haven't yet tried actuating this. That's your falling, but that would be kind of nice. So there's a lot of different directions we can go with this. But, give you a summary. So this is the last slide. We looked at some a simple nonlinear model of gliding, and we saw that there's common behaviors that terminal velocity manifold bifurcations. The flying snakes are a living working wing that undulates to maintain balance. And there's auto-rotating devices, you know, maybe they show promise for a sensor availability with it. They're just also interesting in their own. So that's it. Thank you.
If you appreciated this video, please like and subscribe. There are links and other materials in the description.